As a teacher, you've probably heard of the theory of different learning styles. But did you know that this is actually just a myth? The idea of different learning styles has been prevalent in schools for years now. This is the idea that children take in and learn in different ways. According to this theory, kids can be generally grouped as primarily visual, kinesthetic, or auditory learners. According to this theory, using the same instructional methods that align with a student's learning style will increase learning outcomes. For example, in a first grade class, a teacher might address auditory learners by having them listen to stories. Visual learners might look at pictures, and kinesthetic learners might play with costumes and props. But is this theory really correct? The idea of learning styles most likely came from a variation of Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And although this is a different theory than auditory, visual, or kinesthetic learning, it's still the idea that people have different talents and learn in different ways. But the problem is that Gardner's 8 intelligences haven't been proved as true intelligence, but really talents and skills. For his own theory, that's fine, but when we look at cognitive learning, some of the research doesn't add up. So, how do we know it isn't true? In the last decade, research has been done to disprove the theory. In 2009, Harold E. Pashler, a professor of psychology at the University of California, conducted research on the learning styles theories. He said, if classification of students' learning styles has practical utility, it remains to be demonstrated. In other words, it's a myth. For his report, Pashler grouped test subjects by the supposed learning styles and then randomly assigned the students to learning methods. Some of the visual learners were taught with emphasis on visuals, and some were taught with emphasis on auditory teaching, and vice versa. And in the end, all the students took the same test. What he reported was that there was no strong correlation when students were paired with their supposed preferred method of learning. He did not dispute that individuals have certain learning strengths and preferences, but they concluded that the current evidence that supports the learning style matches approach is virtually non existent. Another reason that psychologists today call learning styles nothing more than a myth is that it doesn't line up with information that we know about how we store new memory when learning. Memory is usually stored independent from the method by which we learn it. Psychologist Daniel Willingham says that we store memories in terms of meaning, not in terms of whether we saw or heard or physically interacted with the information. Different types of representations, visual versus auditory versus kinesthetic, for example, are more effective at storing different types of information. For example, visual memories aren't great at storing meaning because they are often associated with more than one interpretation. And, in general, teachers want students to remember the meaning of something, not just what it looked like or what it sounded like. So, visual learning, auditory learning, and kinesthetic learning are really just methods that carry information that we hope that students will learn and retain. Let's be clear here. No one is saying that students don't have their own talents. One student might have a good visual memory, so they can easily remember locations of things on a map. Another child might have good auditory memory, so they can remember new words in a foreign language with greater ease. Some research even shows that presenting new information in a method that does not match a student's preference can increase the amount of learning that occurs. Research also shows that students will more easily remember new information that's presented in a variety of ways and situations. So now that we've covered the research, we still need to ask, why is this theory so popular? Paul Howard Jones of the University of Bristol found that the concept of learning styles was the most prevalent misconception, with 82% of teachers believing this to be true. It's a theory that sounds good and makes sense. And when we say that students have different learning styles, it's really just another way of saying that people are all different and that those differences should be taken into account in the classroom. So, if it isn't a proven theory, should we get rid of it altogether? What should we do now? First, there are some benefits to this theory, even if it isn't true. The simple act of learning about learning styles encourages teachers to pay more attention to the kinds of instructions that they're delivering. This might encourage a teacher who focuses on auditory instruction to branch out and use visual and kinesthetic teaching techniques. But there's still some problems with accepting a theory that has no scientific research. First, we're wasting time and resources during teacher education in universities, teacher trainings, or in-service days, as well as the cost for curriculums to group students by traits and then teach to those traits. Another problem is that teachers might label students, or students might even label themselves. Thinking that a student learns in a certain style could keep that teacher from trying new and different approaches with a student. A student has labeled themselves with a certain style might shut down or lose interest if a teacher isn't teaching in that same style, which could perpetuate their failure. But it's not because they couldn't learn in that style, it was because they had already stopped trying. So, how should this affect teachers and their teaching approach? In the same study conducted by Paul Howard Jones from the University of Bristol, he found that although teachers have a growing interest in neuroscience and how it might be applied to education, they have difficulty distinguishing between correct and incorrect information about the brain. This is concerning because it means that schools are wasting time, money, and effort to implement brain based teaching methods based on misinformation about neuroscience. But although this theory may lack scientific evidence, it's not necessarily going to lead to bad practice. But teachers should just use it as inspiration, not as an exact guide. Educators should instead focus on developing the most effective ways to present new content. If we do this effectively, we will often involve combining the different forms of instruction anyway, such as diagrams, words, music, and physical activity. Because really, all of these different teaching styles help our students to learn. Now, think back to that first grade class. Doesn't it make sense when they're learning a new topic that they would listen to stories about it, look at pictures, and also play with costumes and props? The best practice isn't really to focus on one certain type of learning or teaching style, but to focus on all of them so that we can give our students as many opportunities as possible to interact with new content in different ways.